Hello, everyone who is currently here with us, and welcome to our panel, One Foot in Each World. So my name is Alexandra Jocic, and I'm a PhD candidate here at the University of Toronto. So just a few housekeeping things to get out of the way. So as most of you are figuring out, you can use the chat to type to us. We also have a Q&A box. So if at any point you have questions that you would like to direct to the panelists, please use the Q&A. If you use the chat, your question will get lost in the chat. So the Q&A box is for questions directed at the panelists. So I'm just going to introduce myself a little bit more and just briefly introduce our panelists and our moderator before getting into the subject of the panel. So as I said, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. My research focuses on the supernatural in modern Japanese and former Yugoslavian literature and its relationship to violence. I'm also the author of two novels, The Hollow Gods and The Echoed Realm, and a short story called The Silent Walls. So joining me on the panel today are two very amazing scholars and people who I am privileged to know. So Dr. Katya Pechenkina, who is a cultural anthropologist, education researcher, and award-winning lecturer at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne, Australia. Katya is also the author of two novels, What the Woods Keep and Oasis. We also have Emmy Higdon, a literary agent with Westwood Creative Artists, which is one of Canada's oldest literary agencies located here in Toronto. They are also a PhD candidate in critical social work at McMaster University. Emmy is also a blogger at Books Beyond Binaries. They are queer and non-binary, originally from Newfoundland and now based in Toronto. And our moderator is Dr. Janet Poole, a distinguished professor of Korean literature here at the University of Toronto in the East Asian Studies Department, which I am in as well. So the focus of today's panel is the intersection of scholarly and creative writing. So your panelists are all people who have one foot in each of these worlds, which is why we named the panel that. And each of us is involved both in scholarly knowledge production and in creative writing, whether it's as an author or as someone who represents authors and sells their work to publishers. And although fiction publishing and academia might seem like very different industries, there is nonetheless overlap, lessons to be learned, and discoveries that I think we've all made along the way. So today we hope to have a casual but hopefully productive conversation about these subjects. And hopefully we can also take this as a step in broadening conversations about knowledge production, writing, and creativity. So although many of you today are tuning in from different parts of the world, before we begin, I do wish to acknowledge that the land on which the University of Toronto operates on, so for thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So given the international scope of this event, I hope that we can all reflect on the land that we are on. So now I'm going to let Katya and Emmy introduce themselves in a little bit more detail. So go ahead.
Should I go first, or Emmy, do you?
Yeah. You go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Alex, for this introduction, and welcome everybody. And I'm really excited to be here. This is the first time that I have a chance to talk about both of my identities as a writer and an academic. Just before I introduce myself briefly, I just want to acknowledge that I am located in Melbourne, in Australia, in South Bank, and that's a land of Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and who are the traditional owners of this land on which I am located and on which I produce my academic and writing knowledge. And I want to pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. About myself, like I said, this is the first time I get to talk about myself from both aspects of my identity, but I'm a writer and an academic. My PhD was on Indigenous education, and I looked into the notion of academic success amongst Indigenous students and scholars. Now I am very eclectic in my academic work, because I'm located in a center that's called Learning Transformations Unit in Swinburne. And what we do, we work with a lot of academics across disciplines. So a lot of knowledge that I produce in academia is interdisciplinary. And I work with some creative writing students as well, who are working on their PhDs that deal with some aspects of genre fiction or various topics within creative writing field. And like Alex said, here are two of my books that I have written in parallel to my academic life. I started writing my first one, What the Woods Keep, when I was still a PhD student. And we can talk a bit more about that if there are any questions about that, about the process. But it really helped me to progress with my academic research and writing, because it really helped me switch off and on between two different things, two different kinds of writing, and it really helped with my mental health during my PhD time. Yeah, and now I'm kind of my identity is dual, and I'm both writer and an academic, and I used to keep these two areas very separate, but they keep kind of blending. It's really hard to keep them separate, and I think it's a very, like, everybody knows, I think, in my academic life that I'm a writer, and everybody in my writing life knows that I'm academic, so I'm really bad at keeping that secret. That's my introduction. Hi everyone.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a whole lot to add in terms of introduction. Alex did a good job. I would echo what you're saying though, Katya. I think that a lot of people, I get asked a lot, at least, like how I came into publishing, because people seem to think that academia and publishing are two like very, very separate worlds. And I think that even the more time I spend in publishing, the more I realize that they're not at all. You know, they're very, I think that a lot of my work in one area informs and has been informed by my work in the other area. My background is in social work, as Alex said, so I've always sort of been in like an interdisciplinary space, because within social work, I've done a lot of practice, like as a frontline social worker in, various social services, mostly around emergency shelter and homelessness, mental health. And then over time, I began working with animals who work in the social work field in a therapeutic setting. So that's like another aspect of my academic work. And then I also work in LGBTQ2S plus health and wellness. So I've always had like fingers in multiple pots within academia. And I think that bringing creative writing into that just felt very natural to me. I was doing a lot of reading and processing of literature in my academic work. And then when you say that your writing helped you get through your PhD, Katya, it was definitely reading for me. I feel like, especially when I was in the early years of my studies, like really light fiction, especially. I don't know how people escape from academic literature without having things to read that are just for fun. So yeah, the more that I did that, the more that I realized that that was where my passion really lay. And eventually I ended up pivoting to working in publishing while I'm finishing up my PhD. So I'm super interested to talk about this, because I feel like it's not something that most people see as reconcilable. And it's definitely something that has overlapped a lot in my professional and my academic work.
Wonderful. Janet, did you want to briefly introduce yourself and then take us away with questions?
Okay, yeah, I'll and then we'll begin. So I'm Janet Poole, and I'd like to thank Alex and Katya and Emmy for inviting me here today. I'm here to moderate. I'm coming from England in Europe, so I'm having a bit of a time difference shock. I'm not a night owl, but I'm really excited to be here in the middle of the night. And I have to say, even though I'm in my third lockdown and not really enjoying it, one of the absolute joys of lockdown, and there are few, is the ability to do these transcontinental meetings. And I found over the past year, I do a yoga class in New Jersey, and I do a reading group in New York, and I'm connecting with people across the world in ways that I didn't used to do, and wondering why I didn't do it before. So this event, I think, is a great example of that. We have 3 continents here. So I teach in the Department of East Asian Studies. My research is focused on Korean literature and on literary translation. I'm also a literary translator, and I'm really interested in the ways in which the art of literary translation and academic writing kind of inform themselves. So I'm very much interested in the connections between these realms. So I think the plan tonight or today, I guess, this morning, wherever you are, whatever time of day it is, we'll go until the top of the hour, and then we're going to take like a 5-minute break and then come back to talk some more. And we're very happy to have questions from the audience. So please feel free to use the Q&A. But in the meantime, I'd like to start us off maybe to get the conversation rolling, and then we'll take questions as they come up. I'd really like to hear more about, it seems like all three of you, from what I can tell, and I may have the trajectory wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, but all three of you seem to have moved from scholarship towards creative writing. So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about the significance of that move to you. And also why you kept one foot in academia, because all three of you have moved into creative writing, but none of you have left academia behind. So this is what I find very interesting. And I'd like to hear a bit more about how, maybe concretely, that process, you know, was it random? Was it planned? How did it happen?
Totally unplanned for me. Do you mind if I go for
Yeah.
no particular order here? I mean, so to be honest, I don't think I ever cleanly moved from one to the other. I've always dabbled in creative writing, but I didn't really take it seriously until my master's degree. And it really became a space for me to explore ideas that interested me in scholarship, but you know, without some of the institutional pressures that exist in scholarship. So they've always felt complementary for me. I do think creative writing gave me some freedom to explore a little bit, you know, in well, creative ways. But academia actually really allows me to crystallize my ideas in a very concrete way. So, you know, when I talk about my fiction, I tend to actually slip back into my academic training. And that has been really important for me, to be honest. So I think that the two are very neatly wrapped up, and it's very difficult for me to separate them. Like Katya, I also, you know, began creative writing mostly as kind of also a catharsis, and you know, it really helped my mental health as well. And also, you know, when I get a chance to actually talk about literature in an academic setting, it gives me space to take it seriously, not just from the standpoint of a creative writer, but also from a place of inquiry rather than a place of entertainment. And that's something that's just very important to me. So ultimately, these two spheres kind of fulfill different engagements, but both of them are very important.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Emmy? Sorry.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, what it comes back to always is the idea of story. I feel like going into social work as an academic, that was part of what drew me, was that, you know, people come to social services and come to places in which they encounter therapists or counselors with everyone has such a rich story to tell. And I think that that's always the basis of social work practice and social work research, is acknowledging that, you know, the person that you see sitting in front of you is really just a compilation of all of their experiences and all of the things that they've had to manage throughout their life. And in some cases far beyond like their own personal life, but back into their history as well. And so, you know, that was something that really drew me into social work as a field to begin with. And the more that I did social work practice, the more that I did social work research, that was what really kept me engaged, was that, you know, a lot of my work in research and in academia and in writing has been around understanding what I can of other people's stories and trying to use that knowledge and my position in the world to sort of make a positive difference. I started working in a bookstore to be able to pay for my academic work, which I think is something that you know, really, I think a lot of students struggle with. I think a lot of academics struggle with, is how to sort of afford a lifestyle that maybe they weren't sort of like naturally sort of introduced to. I was the first in my family to go to college. And so the idea of having to pay for school and having to figure that out, especially, like not just 4 years in after I had already taken out student loans and things like that, but more in like a long-term life kind of way. Took me down a road where I was sort of exploring how to make my academic work for me in order to be able to continue to pursue it. So there were stories that I wanted to tell through research that, I had to find a way to make work. And so I ended up in the bookshop because of that. And I think that sort of the idea of social justice, the bookshop I ended up working in was an independent store that focused on education and on having diverse titles, and curating lists of books for customers and for educators and caregivers of children that, had stories on them that were going to open people's minds to ideas that they might not encounter otherwise. And I think that all of that experience I've brought with me into publishing. A lot of the skills are the same in my literary, like my job as an agent versus my research work. I live a lot in spreadsheets. I do a lot of editing. I do a lot of like what would be considered peer review in academic worlds. But, for my clients, essentially critical reading of their work is like the service that I provide beyond just selling their work to publishers or being able to position it in the market. And so I think that, that idea of storytelling and the idea of trying to make, an industry better and trying to make people's lives better are all things that are like really common and congruent between academic work and publishing. And I don't think that those things detract from each other, which is why I haven't really stepped away from either of them in any significant way, I guess, over the course of both of my kind of careers.
Mm-hmm. And do you write yourself for
I do. I mean, definitely over the past, so I'm finishing my PhD this year, but over the past 7 years, definitely my focus has been on academic writing. So I've done a ton of publishing of journal articles and things like that. And I do creative writing as well, but I've never pursued it professionally just because my focus has always been, finishing my dissertation, getting the publications that I need to have my academic credentials and all of those things as well. So I'm really looking forward. I've already started projects, along the way that I'm really looking forward to devoting more attention to when my dissertation is out of the way and stops taking up all of my spare time.
It's so fascinating because you have like 3 entries to this conversation, right? That you're both doing a PhD, you write yourself, and you're also invested in allowing other people to tell their stories and bringing them to the market. So I hope we can hear more about that later.
Thank you.
But maybe Katya could talk a bit about how she came to have all of those books behind you on the shelf. So impressive.
Yeah, that's, by the way, very fascinating introduction from Emmy. Really interesting to hear. I think in my case, I was similar to Alex in the sense that I was always writing something from a very young age. I was always writing poetry, short fiction. I was a big reader, but I'm originally from Russia. I'm an immigrant in Australia, and growing up in my family, kind of writing was a hobby. It was never thought of as a career. It was never thought of something that can make, can put food on the table or pay rent. So it was always encouraged in the sense of creative endeavor. It's great for you, but you need a real job. So that's why, and I come from a family, there are a lot of academics in my family, and that's kind of all I knew growing up. My dad is an academic, my aunt is in that field. So I was always surrounded by that, and it was always assumed that I would eventually get a PhD. It was something that it just was part of like my blood growing up, And when I immigrated and I, came to Australia, I think it gave me a bit of a space to, think back at myself and think about my choices. And I went into PhD because I wanted to do it. It's, it was expected of me, but I wanted to do it. It was an interesting thing to do. And I had a wonderful experience. But then I started thinking, all my life, I kind of did what was expected of me, what was asked of me, what people thought would be good for me. What do I want from myself? And I was already in my 30s when I realized I always loved writing. Why can't I do that as a more, specific, focused effort to create something? So it started like a very organic process. I started writing my first book, which eventually became What They Would Skip when I was in my maybe second year of a PhD. And the field I was in, I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I'm interested in, critical race theory and in how racism exists and in what ways it shows itself in universities. And, these are hard topics, these topics that can make you really upset and really angry and, drain you of energy. And I think because I was working in that field, which I love every moment of it, but I started writing the book on the side as a way to maybe like compensate for that, very intense academic practice. So by the time I finished my PhD, I had a book ready, kind of written, and I thought, well, I might as well try and publish it. So I started looking for agents because I thought that self-publishing would not be good for me because I literally didn't know much about the process. It was like learning so much from scratch. So I thought, no, I have to try, do the traditional way. So I started looking for agents, and I found one. She got back to me saying, oh yeah, I love it. Like, yeah, I can totally try and sell this book. It reminds me of Labyrinth, which was my favorite movie as a child. So I was like, oh yeah, it was my favorite movie as growing up. Anyway, so she signed me up to represent me, and then she sold the book, and then she sold another book that was kind of in the beginning stage of it. So I ended up with a contract for 2 books, and at the beginning of my academic career. So I guess right now I find more ways to bring the two together, but at the time I kind of saw them as 2 separate things. But now looking back at the topics that I wanted to explore in my book, the way, the themes, what's interesting to me. Oh my gosh, like it's such a psychoanalysis in a way, because you kind of see your maybe even academic interests slip into your writing. Because in my first book, it's about a woman who is like, she doesn't know some part of her history, of her family history, but she's haunted by language, she's haunted by imagery. And I was like, oh wow, okay, I'm an immigrant and I have, this language that I'm trying to keep in my life, my native tongue. And anyway, it's the parallels are there, but I think we do it sometimes subconsciously, but now I do it more consciously. I think there are way more ways of interaction between the 2 practices. And I think we can talk more about that when we maybe talk about methods and how writing, creative writing can come into our academic writing. And right now experimenting with that because there's so many ways to make the 2 fields interact.
I think we could also have a good conversation about The Labyrinth, because that was also my childhood favorite movie. So
oh, isn't this wonderful? And that's the thing about sometimes finding the right agent for you is finding these connections, because that's how we connected with that particular agent. And we had so many other similarities, even though she's an American and I'm Russian, and we had so many things to talk about. And she was perfect agent for that book. So yeah.
I do think that the fact that Emmy and I are both in academia is probably part of the reason why Emmy is my agent now. So there's stuff there.
There's an interesting triangle going on, isn't there, between agents, scholars and writers. I guess I'm hearing a lot about the idea that the creative writing was somehow therapeutic or somehow a help in an academic life, which I guess presumes 2 things: that academia is hard to bear, maybe, and somehow creative writing allows you to do things or have time that is somehow more nurturing in a way. Is that what I'm hearing from all of 3 of you in certain ways, right? I guess I wonder what do you see happening in creative writing that you don't see happening in scholarship, right? I know there's a lot of overlap as well, but what is it kind of distinct? What's the distinct experience? Or is it in the writing, the method, you in your room writing, or is it in audience, or what is it that creative writing allows you to do?
I mean, maybe I can start just by pulling out something that Alex said earlier, which is that I think at least for me, there's I mean, publishing is a very competitive industry too, but there's something competitive in academia about sort of the evaluative aspect. Like I find my process for academic writing and creative writing, especially because in my academic work, I am in a critical school of social work, so we do a lot of critical theory. I spend a lot of time reading theory and working with theory, and a lot of my dissertation is based on post-humanist theory. So in a lot of ways, it's not that different from reading fiction, to be honest, or working with fiction. I mean, it's very speculative in nature, and it's very esoteric a lot of the time, but I think that when I write for academia, I'm always in the back of my mind writing for that evaluative audience. You know, I know that the work will be critiqued in a certain way. I know that there are certain sort of benchmarks that people are expecting me to hit with that work, that in creative writing and fiction, I can explore similar ideas, but it's a different kind of freedom and it's a different kind of knowledge translation to a different sort of audience. And I mean, that's restrictive in its own way. I think the two kind of allow outlets for sort of like the limitations of the other.
That's just if I can jump in on that. I think there's a stereotype about academic writing that it's dry, that it's not very fantastical or whatever. It's not very elaborate. It's like you just need to communicate an idea, right? When we have an article to write, the first thing we need to ask ourselves, what is the new contribution to knowledge? What is the one or two things that we want this article to say that's different, or that maybe challenges the field, but what is it? It's very it could become a really technical exercise, and I think some journals they really want that rigidity. They want the introduction, they want the literature review, they want what is the method, what is the question. And some journals are becoming more flexible in that. And what I'm finding, like, for example, Journal of Cultural Studies, that I have published an article in, they don't like that structure. They specifically say, we want your article to be interesting and engaging and enticing and compelling, but we don't want that introduction. We don't want that literature review section, be more creative. And I find, like, right now I'm at the stage of my academic career where I feel more brave to break those rules of academic writing and to write more colorfully or use interesting metaphors. And there's some academics who write beautifully. When you just read it, it's like it could be a creative writing, or it could be a creative nonfiction or something. Like it's pleasure to read. And there are some very dense academic texts that can put you off, because like it takes you 10 minutes to read the same paragraph, especially if you're not a native speaker like myself. I still have some limitations to what I have to read several times to understand just the idea of it. And I think those two can be quite separate, but you can find the right outlet for something creative. And where I am in anthropology, ethnography is one of our main methodological frameworks, and that allows a lot more creativity than, say, some more rigid method like, say, quantitative survey or something that you just report on data. 10% said this, 20% said that. That's okay, but when you deal with more creative methods like storytelling or ethnographical ways of approaching knowledge, of constructing knowledge, you can be more creative. You can talk about your own experience, you can use interesting metaphors, you can even draw on anecdotes or vignettes. So there are aspects of creativity that can go into academia. But I think still academia can be very rigid and very inflexible in what journals actually publish and how editors make decisions on academic articles. And we have the peer review process in academia, which is quite specific. It depends who you get. You can get somebody who agrees with those ideas, or you can get somebody who hates that method and says, no, this is the worst method, the worst article ever written. And you can get two very different reports from peer reviewers. So and it's something like you grow a thick skin, like you can say whatever, it's fine. But but creative writing can have that element as well. You're exposing yourself to the world, and everybody can say whatever they want about your books or yourself. So I kind of lost the track a bit, but I think there are similarities. And yeah.
I think sometimes I have the impression, I think you're right, the academic writing is, there's a very strong evaluative process, but certainly in my experience supervising students, I feel that often the students themselves seem to be the most embedded sometimes in the idea of having to have a lit review, having to have this, have that. Whereas if you talk to academic publishers, they don't want that, right? And frankly, if professors often don't want to read it either because it's not very interesting. So I sometimes wonder if there isn't a little bit more room than we think there is, and maybe we unnecessarily restrict ourselves in the terms of what academic writing, how we imagine it to be. I mean, I guess maybe that's a question I'd like to, I mean, how does your kind of imagination of what is creative and what is academic, how do you think that shapes the writing that you produce? And I guess it brings me to, we've had a question here, we've got several questions, but this one I think is on topic. So I'll go to the second question first, which is, have you kind of in academic scholarly writing kind of consciously or directly used creative nonfiction approaches? So have you actively tried adapting your scholarly writing from what you've learned from creative writing? Is that
I feel
one?
like this is maybe a very simplistic answer, but one thing I will say that when I was an earlier PhD student, I had a colleague, Margaret Robinson, who is an Indigenous woman who works out on the east coast of Canada. And she really changed the way I thought about scholarly writing by, as a professor at the time and a researcher, taking a creative writing course at U of T, because she was finding after like many, many years of scholarly writing, she was reading her own work and she was like, this is just boring to me. Like it's not resonating the way I want it to. And so she thought to herself, like, well, what does? And she used to read a lot of, like novels and especially genre fiction. And she thought, like, I would like to be able to captivate people in that same way. And so she decided to take a creative writing course at OISE. And I remember she wrote like murder mystery stories during that course. And we would have, like academic meetings in which she'd be brainstorming these ideas for these murder mystery stories. And it really made me change, like it really took down that binary in my mind of academic or scholarly versus creative nonfiction. Like in so many ways, I mean, obviously we want to portray our data and our academic contributions as accurately and as, truthfully as we can. But especially in, I think, quantitative disciplines, there is so much bias that comes up anyway that we have to find different ways to manage that and to work with that. And I think using a creative lens is one way that can really, like, it can make that into a strength of your work rather than a weakness in a lot of ways. And I found that really inspiring when I was like quite early in my PhD studies. And that's something that I think I still carry with me.
Well,
yeah, and
maybe Alex, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So actually something that stuck out to me that Katya mentioned a while back that relates to this question is the way that themes and ideas that you're interested in, perhaps in an academic capacity, actually kind of filter through into your creative work. And that's not always conscious. And I think the fact that it's not conscious is where a lot of that freedom comes from. And at least that was my experience. And so even though I write fantasy and horror, the thing that I didn't see coming through in my fictional writing was actually this sort of diasporic imagination, which is something Katya and I have had conversations about at length. And so in terms of incorporating kind of these creative processes back into academia, it wasn't until I really realized what I was doing on a sort of subconscious level that I was able to bring that back into academia. And so, still being in the phase of writing my dissertation, there are many times when I will actually be, reading my scholarly works and I will kind of be reminded of something from my own book and go, oh yeah, it's like that theme that I didn't realize I was writing about, and I bring it back into my scholarship. And so it is not actually uncommon for me to take arguments that I put into my novels and then actually pose those same arguments in my scholarly work, but just rephrase it in a slightly different way. And so it has actually allowed for much more fluidity between the two, and just I'm much more comfortable with academic writing being a messier process now, because in my imagination, creative writing is messy. academic writing is not. And so that binary has been kind of deconstructed for me, which is great. So
I think also, Alex, in your area, because you work with literature, and it lends itself a bit more organically, right? Because you talk about literature, you teach about literature, and I think you're very well positioned to identify what those interconnections are between your fiction and your work, your academic work. I think other disciplines are more rigid. I think it's possible, but it's difficult. Like, for example, there's a physicist that I really like, Lisa Randall, and she's like superstar. And I have her book where she writes about dark matter, and she talks about very complex mathematical constructs and models, and yet she writes in this beautiful lyrical language about dark matter, that she employs these metaphors about how sometimes when you walk through a forest you can't see the wildlife, but it's there because you hear the sounds of it. So dark matter is like this, it's there based on, so it's beautiful. Like, you can do it, it's possible to do it in physics. But I think also in anthropology, and when you employ certain creative methods to talk about complex issues, there are new angles that could be revealed that way. Like with one of my co-authors, Dr. Helena Liu, who is Australian Chinese leadership scholar, and we write about racism within universities and within organizations. And one of the articles we wrote together, we based it on our own experience. So it's autoethnographical. We went to the same events and we had different agendas, and we experienced in different ways. And then we came together and we had a lot of this like debriefing about anxieties that we felt that were very similar, even though I was the one kind of perpetrating the university agenda upon her, and she was, supposed to receive it. So anyway, we wrote an article about it, and we used like creative method of vignettes. So I described my story, she described her story, and then we wrote one together, how we both felt. So that's like a creative methods from creative writing, almost like creative nonfiction coming into academia. And editors loved it, and we published it, and it was a great experience to do it that way. It was also very helped us, relieve that experience, but feel like we gained some power back because we felt disempowered, I guess. And yeah, so I think there are new possibilities that can open if we bring different methods into academic research and writing.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question here that maybe speaks to that, which is that Alice says that sometimes it seems that academics look down upon creative writing, and would like to know why the panelists might think that is, and how you deal with that. How do you deal? I mean, do you feel that there's a kind of hierarchy between creative writing and academic writing? Or is that a hierarchy that changes in different situations? And how do you deal with that? Do you think you've internalized a hierarchy in some ways? And how do you deal with that situation?
Well, I have a lot. Oh. Yeah, you go ahead. I have a lot to say about this.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I think it really depends on what the creative writing is, who wrote it, all kinds of things. So, I mean, I think there are works of creative writing that are taken very seriously as objects of study. And I think the question of what is a acceptable object of study is where we start to maybe see a hierarchy. So I think if something doesn't really qualify as an object of study in the eyes of academics, then we might say there's a hierarchy. So for example, genre fiction is something that is generally relegated to not serious fiction, I guess. And so people who write genre fiction, and this is especially, a topic of debate in science fiction and fantasy communities, that fiction is not seen as valuable as literary fiction. And so that is a place where I have also felt that hierarchy. And I do think I've internalized it to a degree as someone who writes genre fiction. So for a while, I wasn't comfortable admitting in academic circles that I write genre fiction because I thought I would be sneered at, which is silly, but that impression comes from somewhere. But yeah, Katya, I know you have really strong feelings about this. So
yes, I don't know if maybe Amy wants to go first before me.
No, I mean, I'm happy to let both of you answer this one. I think the only thing that I would say is that I think that that hierarchy extends well beyond like the idea of, you know, academic versus creative. I think that within publishing, there's also like a very clear stratification of what even readers, like just everyday people in bookstores, consider to be like a great book. I think we see that in the awards structures that exist, like especially in Canada, to be honest, where most of our awards, the vast majority, if not all of them, like, in order to qualify, the book has to be categorizable as literary fiction, which is just the most ridiculous thing I can think of. Like, I mean, there's no question that it takes the same amount of skill and hard work to write, you know, like a romance novel that's going to blow readers out of the water as it does to write a scholarly dissertation. It's just a different kind of skill. But of course, like, I don't think that it's contained within sort of a scholarly, like, object of study field. I think that that kind of hierarchy has implications for all readers and all people who are writing. And I'm sure, Katya, you probably do have a lot of thoughts on this, because I feel like the same thing happens to young adult authors as well. People who write for children are often, you know, like a lot of people think that picture books, for example, are super, super simple to write, when in fact they're incredibly difficult to craft. Yeah, there's so much to be said, but I think that just to say that that's not a limited kind of hierarchy, it definitely extends well beyond the borders of the university.
I think we have a lot of people in the chat, because I can see the comments appear, and they really connect with that. I think there are a lot of feelings around, you know, what is the award-worthy literature, what is the, you know, worthy fiction, who writes that fiction, and you know, because I think, you know, young adult, for example, you know, as a category, writing for children has been traditionally assigned to writers who don't identify as men. So, you know, there is something to be said about that as well. So why don't you see that as, you know, why do you put down young adult fiction? Think about that. You think about elitism behind it. Think about various biases that you have, perhaps. And I think in academia, like I had very good people who understand, like in my life, in my academic career, I came across people who react differently if I say, if I tell them that I have a book, that I write books, fiction books for younger readers. And I had very supportive, you know, bosses in my job, in my role, who were wonderful about it. They went to my events, they bought a book, they read the book, and they loved the book. But I had some you know, managers in the past who I didn't feel comfortable telling them, because they felt like it was, you know, I was wasting my time. Am I doing that at the expense of my academic work? You know, is this taking over my life? Do I write at work? You know, this kind of a lot of issues there. And I remember once I had nobody that I currently work with, but somebody that I used to work with in the past, and something was said to me in a meeting, something like, oh, but you know, are you even taking this job seriously, because you have your other thing going, and maybe you will leave us and go do that? And I was like, what? First of all, I've never mentioned to this person that I'm doing that, so clearly that there were rumors about that. And you know, I don't keep that secret. It's not a secret or anything. I'm not ashamed of that. And I said to that person, I said to them, well, you know, I'm here and I have a PhD, and I value my academic role. I worked hard to get where I am. Why do you think I'm not taking this seriously? I have a lot of publications. I have PhD students. I teach. Like, what else do you expect of me? How do you want me to prove my loyalty to academia? And yes, I write books as well, and I write fiction books. So it really depends on how specific people see it. And you know, I found right now a good place for myself, because I established some collaborations with people from writing department. And you know, these are my people, in the sense that they are writers and they are academics. It's part of their identity. So we do some interesting work together. We supervise students together in creative writing. And I feel like, yeah, I belong in that field, and I also do my other academic work, which is also interdisciplinary and interesting, I hope. So I personally, there are a lot of things there, but literary versus fiction versus genre, a young adult versus for adults, which the barrier between those is very vague. Sometimes you pick up a young adult fantasy and the character is 19 years old and refers to themselves as a grown-up, so, and that's a young adult. Well, maybe, but not really, is it? And I was told things like my first novel, What the Wood Skip, has an 18-year-old protagonist, and as part of the plot, they travel to two 18-year-olds travel to a different state. And one of the rejections that I got from an agent was saying, I don't believe that 18-year-olds could do that they could be on the plane by themselves. And I was like, what? That is a strange reason. Okay, that person didn't feel like she believed that could happen. And I was very surprised, and my agent was very surprised. But that's one person's opinion. So yeah, there are different biases that exist that definitely create these divisions that I don't believe are real. It's a fantasy. Those divisions are made up. They're constructs, but they exist.
Maybe one thing that creative writing and academia shares is this kind of sense that they should be vocations, right? And therefore you betray one, the other, supposedly, whereas what all three of you are saying, it seems to me, is that they can actually enrich each other and bring something new. I mean, we have a lot of questions here, but this is a good one, I think. Practically, how do you do all of this, right? How do you, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately, especially because screen time can be overwhelming. And if you have two vocational activities that both involve sitting in a room at your computer, just how do you, and maybe you can give us some practical suggestions too, because I'm sure lots of people listening are already writing, writers or thinking about embarking in other directions. Practically, how do you manage this one foot in two worlds, right? Do you do one then the other? Do you have both going at the same time? Do you have, morning on your academic article, evening on the novel, or just how do you do it? I'd be curious to hear.
My optometrist hates me. He's always complaining that I have chronically dry eyes. So that tells you about the screen time. I mean, I've always done both at the same time. I do think that there's actually a lot more that goes into creative writing than just staring at the screen and writing. There's a lot of research, right? So I mean, the academic research skills come in very handy. There's a lot of research, a lot of thinking, a lot of scheming, a lot of plotting, a lot of outlining, a lot of just letting things percolate when you're not even at the screen. And I find that the actual writing part takes place in just short bursts. Some days I'll write 73 words, other days I'll write 250, then some days I'll write 2,000. But at the end of the day, like, all of these endeavors are long haul things. It's a marathon, it's not a race. And so when you decide to write a book, that's going to take you like a year or two, depending on what else you have going on. Most of the manuscripts I've read or that I've written have taken me anywhere from 8 months to 2 years. And the one that took me 2 years was much easier to edit because I took my time with it. Emmy knows this. So I really think that the way that I get it done is just by having patience with myself. And making space where it's needed, and things just get done slowly.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. It's a marathon. It's a long-term endeavor. So I think in my case, because I've been working from home for the past year because of the global pandemic, so it made things a lot easier. But I used to in the past, when I would have to get on the train and travel but 20 minutes to campus, I would write down some ideas for a creative project, like literally on my phone as a message to myself, as an email to myself. So because you're always thinking about things, and your project, like your current project, it does occupy a big portion of your mind. So what I would do, I would work, at my lunch break. While I was on campus, I would go away to a cafe and take my laptop, and I would work a little bit if I can. Sometimes my brain wouldn't let me. It really depends. You could be really tired, you could be occupied with something else. But I think, look, I think it's it's easy for me to say because I don't have any care duties. I don't look after small children. Perhaps I have a bit more time than somebody else would. But I have a lot on my plate, and I teach, I supervise, so I have 9 to 5 work that I open my laptop and I do my academic work because that's what I do. That's my job. If I wake up earlier, I work a little bit on my book, and during lunch break, I'll work a little bit on my book. And if I feel not completely tired after 5 p.m., I'll work a little bit on my book. And then the weekends, I'll work a lot on my book. So it's really about like making commitment, and you're really serious about writing the book, and you will eventually write a book if you do it little by little. Even if you write 500 words or 100 words, or if you're lucky more than that, it still goes towards something. And sometimes like a couple of days ago, I had this raging migraine, and I still like, no, I have to do this, I have to do a little bit. And I wrote a little bit, and I felt like it's probably useless what I've written. And the next day I reread it, I was like, actually, that's quite okay. So I can use some of this. So but also be kind to yourself. It's a marathon. You'll get there eventually if you're dedicated to doing this, but don't push yourself too, because you can exhaust your brain, and then you'll be out for a week and you can't do anything creative or otherwise.
So it sounds that you have a 9 to 5 work life, and then the writing that's kind of your separation of time that you give it. I'm guessing that's harder to do when you're like a PhD candidate, which doesn't really have any kind of 9 to 5 structure, right? So you're going to have to create those structures yourself in whichever way works for you. And we seem to have lots of people who want some tips. So I'm wondering if you have any advice or suggestions, what worked for you in terms of dividing up the activities and dividing your time.
I mean, I think I have 3 answers to this question, and none of them are going to be satisfying. So I've been trying to choose which one to delve in on. I think that first, I think dispelling the notion that it is, the idea that someone has an entire life to devote to a vocation, I think is a very outdated and sort of privileged way of looking at like either academia or fiction writing. I think that is sort of a myth that, is like mostly a misogynistic structure. First of all, is that this idea that, someone could spend their entire day, their entire life working on a novel. There's so few people, or working as a scholar for that matter, there's so few people who actually have that, that opportunity, especially obviously in 2021, but I mean, always there have been women authors, for example, or women scholars who balance parenting, or who balance caring for their husband, or homemaking, as it were, in the past and currently. I think that there's a lot of perceptions about that being, not a job, those extra responsibilities that women have always balanced. And so I think that the idea that a person gets to have a vocation that they dedicate sort of their whole self to is something that is sort of a myth. I'm maybe not articulating that clearly, but that's sort of my first thought. My second is that I had a great therapist once who told me that one of the most important things to do as a scholar was to remember that thinking was essentially the job. And so whether you're, like taking a shower in the middle of the day and sort of just letting your ideas wash over you, or whether you're making a healthy meal because your brain needs B12 to be able to function, all of those things are actually part of the work. Like whether you mean to be like, whether those are billable hours or not, there are all times that scholarly ideas, creative ideas, they're still in our minds 24 hours a day. So in terms of like divvying up the time, I don't know that it's so much about seeing it as task-based as it is sort of acknowledging that we're all doing all of this work all the time. Whether, it looks that way from the outside or not is sort of debatable. And then my last answer is that, you know, for many of us, like a 9 to 5 structure isn't something that works for people. Speaking as somebody who has disabilities and specifically psychiatric disabilities, working like 9 to 5 in an office, whether it was in a scholarly setting or, you know, when I was working retail, I've done these things, you know, because everybody does at some point in their life, but it's extremely difficult for me to function that way. And actually working in the way that I work now, where I can, if I need a 15-hour workday, I can do that. And if I need 3 hours in the afternoon to go walk my dog in the middle of the day, I can do that too, as long as I, you know, plan ahead and I'm strategic about how I use my energy and my time. So yeah, I use a lot of apps. That's honestly my advice to everyone, is to use all the apps that work for you, because I structure my time like sometimes down to the minute, like really it's sort of compulsively, but it's the best way that it works for me. And sometimes that means I'm doing work at 9 p.m. and I'm scheduling my emails so that they go out during normal business hours so that they're not disrupting other people's lives. But if that's the time of the day that it feels good to get that done and that the productivity is possible, then that works really well for me. And it means that, you know, at 11 in the morning when I need to take a nap, I don't feel bad about doing that, as long as I'm not blowing off a responsibility that I've otherwise taken on. So I don't know that those are helpful in terms of practical strategies, but
No, I think they're really helpful. I mean, I think that this idea of a more flexible, I guess I was also thinking though, that there's always that danger, right? That flexible attitude to time, which I think many of us thrive on, can also lead to the fact you never really get time off, right? And certainly,
oh, I
um,
schedule that in too.
okay. Okay, so maybe this is a good point. We have to take a break, so maybe we'll take it now and come back with some more practical tips, that because we have a lot more questions from the audience. So we are going to take a break, I'm told, for 10 minutes. Okay, and yeah, I guess this is different from when you can just talk to the person next to you in the audience, right? How does a Zoom break work? We just all go away and
I
break.
don't know. We turn off
Well, the chat will be
video.
open, I
The chat will
presume.
be
So if
open.
people want to
Okay,
chat
I
with each
can
other.
keep going. I'll keep reading it, and you feel free to keep uploading questions. Yeah, and also get up. We all know, stand, stretch, and especially when it's 1 in the morning, and come back at 10 past. I don't know what time, just 10 past 8.
The hour.
Standard time, 10 past 8. Yeah. Okay, and we'll see you all in soon. Maybe let's get to some of the questions. So we have a question that's been up here for a while, is can the panelists say more about how creative writing helps their mental health, and why do you think this is the case? I mean, this is a theme that's come up, I think, from all three of you. So how do you think about the relationship between creative writing and mental health? Which kind of also implies that somehow academia does not help mental health. But anyway, I'm kind of curious in the way that binary works.
So actually, one thing for me is that it's not just academia. So one of the biggest mental health stressors in my life is chronic illness. I have type 1 diabetes, and so managing that, you know, day in and day out is actually extremely stressful and makes everything you do more complicated. So for me, it wasn't directly academia that was causing mental health stressors. It was actually the very confusing intersection of diabetes, you know, social life, academia, family, kind of the way that those things come together to create a rather messy web of problems that are difficult to untangle. And so in that respect, creative writing was great for me. But again, a lot of it was subconscious. So one of the big themes in my book, The Hollow Gods, that's not very obvious is chronic illness. And it's something that I didn't even realize, but I was driven to explore things like grief, or, you know, living with something that is chronic. And even though none of the illnesses are my illness, they were chronic illnesses nonetheless that my protagonists have to deal with. And so exploring that through another person's psychology, in this case, the character's psychology, was actually extremely therapeutic for me and gave me a language to talk about my own experiences. And I think considering the way that fiction writing can actually constitute a language to make sense of things was really important for me.
That's a great point. So is it something about having characters as a creative writer that you maybe don't have in academic writing?
For me, yes. Yeah.
You said that exploring it through a character gives you some kind of therapeutic distance maybe, or something like that.
Yes, for me specifically, I really love writing characters and writing complex characters and morally gray characters. And part of what is so rewarding about fiction writing for me is exploring their psychology and seeing how they respond to a conflict that I give them. And oftentimes that conflict is something that is actually important to me, or that is, a question for me.
Mm-hmm.
And you do it so well, because I was lucky enough to read both of Alex's books. Yeah, I'm gonna say nice things about you. I was lucky enough to read both of your books and blurb them. And actually, I have to say, with everything I just said about social media, that's how we met. I believe with you, Alex, we met on Twitter, and we started talking. I had a lot of things in common, and I ended up blurbing Alex's debut book, The Hollow Gods, and I recently finished reading the sequel, the Echoed Realm, and I think in my blurb I don't say it, but maybe I should. You write this empathy-inducing horror that is scary and yet so emotionally complex and rich and relatable, and even the character that we think is an antagonist, in the end, what you leave us with is a feeling of empathy. And I think that's what great horror is. And horror is another genre that's been attacked and misunderstood, I think. And whenever I say, my books, the first one could be, both of them could be considered horror as a genre. And yet both times the publisher made a decision not to market them as that, because they know it would immediately just put off a lot of people. And even, amongst my friends, sometimes I say that technically those are horror books, and they say, ew, the first reaction is, I don't read horror, I don't like horror. But you write horror that it's scary, but also that comes through that empathy and understanding of characters. And your books are wonderful, and I love that. That's exactly the kind of horror supernatural books that I like, because they make a statement about us, about our biases, about our fears as a society, about some paranoia that some societies feel about something, and how they enact that as violence against vulnerable people in their communities. So yes, I think your fiction definitely succeeds in doing that.
Well, thank you very much.
Compliment accomplished.
Thank you very much. And I would definitely consider your books to be horror. Oasis especially leans in real hard with cosmic horror, which is what I loved about it. So I am a little bit sad that marketing needs to avoid certain terms, I guess, to draw in as many readers as possible. But I especially love Oasis precisely because of its ambiguities and the way that it incorporates this sort of almost ontological horror, which is also kind of a academic interest of mine as well.
I'm going to be the squeaky wheel on this one, and especially based on some of the comments in the chat, because I think it's so interesting that we're positioning academia as this sort of criticism-based field and culture, whereas publishing and creative writing is like positioned as this therapeutic, sort of emotionally driven, because that certainly hasn't been the case for me. I definitely use emotional energy when I'm writing as opposed to getting it. And the same thing with academic writing, to be honest. And I think part of that is because I'm also involved in sort of the industry side of publishing and not just the writing side. And I feel like you might get very different answers about like whether or not writing is therapeutic from authors who haven't yet been published, if you were having this conversation, because certainly like there is a cathartic and like creative outlet aspect to creative writing. And I think as well in scholarly writing, it sort of opens doors for you to think about things in ways that you might not otherwise have the opportunity to. But ultimately in publishing, I mean, the acquisitions board process is very similar to the peer review process in the sense that most of my job happens after all of that has been completed. So writing and the cathartic part and like the fun creative aspects are really enriching for a lot of people, but if they can never successfully market or sell their book, it becomes a much more stressful and like very capitalist influenced position to be in. I think a lot of authors are in a really, really difficult spot when, for example, editor rejections come back with consistent feedback that might not be easy to hear. So I think it depends a lot on whether you're writing just for yourself or whether you're writing in order to be published or for an audience. Because there are a lot of things like for example, when you're saying, you know, it's unfortunate that your books aren't marketed as horror, but on some level, like Alex is saying that, and I feel that because we both read horror and we love horror. But the reality is that most people, most readers will say that they don't read horror and that they're scared of it. And so you're alienating people by using that language as a marketing professional, right? And they know that. And so they're going to spin them in different ways so that more people will pick up the books. But of course, if they had come back during your writing process and said, can you write this book differently so that it appeals to different people? Like that's a very difficult decision to make as an author. And it's definitely something I've worked through with a lot of my clients is whether or not, you know, to what degree, I guess, they're willing to compromise their creative outlets in order to invite other people into those and to benefit from those financially. So it's sort of like, it's an interesting juxtaposition for me because I think that publishing feels very much like scholarship. Once you kind of move beyond the initial, like, okay, the words are on the page and that feels good to do or not good to do.
Such great points, Amy. You're right. I mean, writing can be wonderful, but the process around publishing can have
so
a
tricky.
lot of pitfalls. Yeah.
Yeah.
And even, you know, for like in my case, nothing is guaranteed, right? Like I have 2 books published and I'm trying to sell more books, but you still get rejections. You still get a lot of, you know, a lot of these upsets in your life that I'm more prepared for it and, you know, it doesn't affect me as much, but it's still there and it's a very unstable sort of thing to be in because, you know, sometimes people ask me, why don't you go full-time writing? And I was like, well, how am I going to feed myself?
Exactly. Also, there's no such thing as like a tenured author. You know what I mean? Like there's no career path in publishing where you sort of get to sit down and say like, okay, I've made it and now I can write, you know, like that point never really comes.
Sure. And you if you're lucky, maybe you get a very nice book deal, you know, very, very nice, a major book deal. And maybe you have more books under contract. If you have, I don't know, 5 books under contract and they just paid you, you know, a 7-figure for your book or something, yeah, maybe you can then quit your job. But then think about in 5 years' time, if you haven't sold another book for 7 figures,
Exactly.
You know, and you still have to pay tax on those. And, you know, in my case, I have to pay tax in the US and in Australia. So it's like, it's not a lot of money if you think about it.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the structural issues that you have in academia can also be found in the publishing industry, right? Like who decides what gets published? I mean, that's the sort of elephant in the room for me a lot of the time. Even when we talk about diversifying stories and diversifying publishing, at the end of the day, the actual makeup of the people making these decisions is kind of the same. So, I mean, we sometimes joke that academia is like a dinosaur, right? It's very slow moving. You know, people are resistant to change, but I think publishing is kind of the same. So, I mean, a lot of Emmy's squeaky wheel comments actually completely resonate, and those are frustrations that I've also shared. So, I think it is important to make this distinction between creative writing as a process and then publishing as a process, because as soon as you want, you know, to sell your work, it's a different animal, right? And that's and that's one of the driving tensions is, you know, your quote unquote creative vision, and then the need to actually market this, and even when you succeed at marketing it, like not everyone's going to read your work the way you want it to, because your audience is so different in publishing than it is in academia. And so you're going to get people with what you would consider to be bad takes. and you know, you have to live with that. And so the criticism never quite stops. So rejections are awful, especially if They are revealing of perhaps an editor's biases, and that's actually one of the ways that we see, institutional structures are a problem regardless of where you are. But then it also continues, when you are published, and you're kind of surrounded by people's opinions.
Never read the Goodreads reviews.
Oh, I know.
I was just going to make a comment about that, in the sense that after you publish a book and it's out there, I just don't engage with that anymore, because, and I'm not saying this arrogantly, like I don't care what you think, but it's just, there is nothing that I can take away, in the sense that this book is already out there. It's living a life of its own. So I cannot control how people read it. I cannot control what issues they might take with it, or how they maybe love it or not love it. There is nothing I can do. I mean, there's maybe a scope to say that I can learn for the future, but I am learning. It's a process, and I know what's going on. You have to know what's going on in the field, right? To be in the field. But it's different with my academic writing, because you can see how people engage with your work. You can see if they cite your work. You can see in what way they cite your work, whether it's critical or not. And I've been I find it fascinating. It doesn't offend me, because they can critically engage with my work. It's fine. It's out there for you to discuss. And I do look up how, citations of my work, for example, my academic articles. And like, I'm currently writing something that reevaluate something that I've written some years ago. So I want to see what people have said about it and address those issues. So somebody said, oh, this typology was something inadequate, and I want to fix that. So I go back and I find that useful. But in creative writing, it's such a subjective thing that it's very hard to argue your point and say you misunderstood this completely. I mean, you can say that, but the way people engage with your book, you cannot control that. It's fascinating.
So it seems like in both academic writing and creative writing, you're subject to markets and readers, but maybe in slightly different ways. And sometimes that dinosaur can be a help, I suspect, even though we don't like it when we're subject to it. But there's a slight little bit of protection from a market, although not totally by any means. We have lots of questions here that are kind of on the more practical side. So I think people really want to know, how you work. So maybe I'll give you a couple at the same time, because they're related. Are you in, or do you recommend being in writing groups, creative? And I think the question implies, would the writing group be a academic writing group, a creative writing group, or would it be kind of a mixture? And then I think related to that, have you used any creative writing based approaches to research with others, such as zines? So in other words, I think both questions are getting to the collaborative, potentially collaborative nature of writing for both academics and creative writers, right? Are you, any of you involved in collaborative enterprises like that? You belong to writing groups?
I'm very solitary, I think.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead. I didn't hear that part.
Oh, reading groups, writing groups.
Oh.
Do you,
Well,
or is it the solitary nature of the both enterprise that attracts you?
I think as a PhD student, I was definitely involved in a lot of reading groups and, critical reading groups where you come together and you discuss a text. I think it's part of an academic experience, and I think it's wonderful for PhD students. And I highly encourage them to seek out people who work in their field of interest and discuss and critique publications. Sometimes an academic himself or themselves can come to these meetings and be critiqued, which have been a part of this, and could be very strange experience, could be wonderful, could be bizarre. In terms of writing groups, I think for PhD students, yes, definitely it's valuable. I know at least one of my PhD students, hi Greg, that he's part of Shut Up and Write, which is something that people come and just sit quietly, just type away in a group. I think that could be very useful to get that word count. Then you have something to work with and edit. In my case, I'm a very solitary creature. I tend to work alone and I tend to write alone. And I've never had I have never been a part of critique group for the creative side of things, but I know some people benefit tremendously from those. Um, I think there is an issue of trust, whether you come together with people that you trust and respect, and you have to be absolutely certain that these are the people you trust, like you can share with them your writing and you trust their advice. We had a one-off little critique workshop with some of my close writing friends, and they have provided wonderful feedback that was so useful to me. So yes, I would highly recommend it. I'm not a part of a writing or reading group at the moment in a structured way, but sometimes I take advantage of that.
Okay.
Yeah, do you want to go ahead, Alex?
Sure. So I am also a bit of a solitary creature like Katya, but I think it really depends on your personality. For academic work, I actually think that writing groups are really helpful as well. It really helps to just be around other people. Well, in the time of COVID, we're not around anyone, but you know, in other circumstances, it is actually great to just have bodies in a room typing. And I have found that very helpful. But for me personally, both with academic writing and creative writing, I like to have a small group of people that I trust with my work, just because I think that accepting feedback is complicated. At least for me, it's complicated because I tend to try to incorporate everyone's feedback, and that's not good. So you need a core group of people. Well, I say you, but I mean me. I need a core group of people that I trust, that I can share my work with, and they give me feedback based on that. My hesitation with creative writing groups is always either that everyone is too scared to hurt your feelings, in which case you get uncritical praise, or it becomes almost like a kind of showmanship where everyone feels the need to say something critical, and it may or may not be off base. And so again, that issue of trust comes up. So that's my perspective, but I do think that both academia and creative writing are more collaborative than we're willing to admit. And you know, in creative writing, like, you know, if you have an agent, your agent does a lot of work to help you actually iron out a manuscript with editorial, with feedback, or even just brainstorming ideas. You know, an editorial team does so much work, and even in academia, this is the case. You know, you do have editors, you have supervisors who collaborate with you, or peers who collaborate with you. So I say I'm solitary, but I say that in recognition of the fact that both of these industries are way more collaborative than they might seem.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you, Alex. I feel like it's interesting to me that, you know, the act of writing is it's a solo sport, right? Like when it comes down to like your fingers on the keyboard, like generally speaking, that process happens alone. But I always sort of laugh, I'm not going to lie, when clients send me manuscripts for editorial feedback that are called like author's name, title, final draft. It just makes me chuckle. And I understand why people do it, because it's very satisfying. You know, you get to the end of your manuscript, you type the end, it like has this real, you get to have this real moment. But the reality is that, you know, like the feedback that my clients get from me, usually through like 1 or 2 rounds, is like the tip of the iceberg. And then they're being handed off to an editor who may have a completely different vision for the novel than I do. And so therefore, like, even though when push comes to shove, writing is an individual activity, there are so many inputs on a novel. It's sort of like, it's like that saying that they say about it takes a village to raise a baby. Like, it's very similar, I think, when you hold a finished novel in your hand in a store, regardless of like how that book was produced, there are so many fingers that have gone into shaping that object. And I feel the same way about scholarship. I mean, even though we spend a lot of time doing a lot of legwork on our own, I think there is, like, it's undeniable that those conversations that we have with other scholars are a huge part of the work that we do in the thinking and in deconstructing our own shortcomings, or even in pushing our ideas in directions that we might not expect. I remember I did a digital scholarship early on in my PhD program, and some of the best material I have in my dissertation came from like being in like there was a social space where all the fellows could sit around and spend time, and those conversations we would have like after classes, just talking about things that were silly, television shows or books that we had read, or how our days were going. Sometimes you just start thinking about your work in a way that you would never have done on your own. So I think even if people don't formally build those processes into their lives, I think it can have some benefit to dip in once in a while, kind of like Katya described, with people who have your best interests at heart and who you admire. Having mentors is super valuable when you can access those sorts of things, whether it's for scholarship or creative writing. I think having that impetus can be unique in its own way, and open your mind to things that it might not come up with just sort of sitting in front of your computer all the time.
I just think that academia has a lot more of those opportunities built in.
Yeah.
Naturally, right? Like even just PhD, it's you meet with your supervisors, fortnightly or however
Exactly.
frequently, and you have like a workshop where they critique your work with kindness in their hearts. Well, ideally, right?
Yeah.
Ideally, they have their best interest in heart, and I was pretty lucky in that sense. And I tried to kind of bring it into my own practice now as a mentor, as a supervisor for PhD students. And you're kind of there to guide them, but it's also their ideas, and you help them develop their ideas without dominating them with your own ideas. But like one of my students right now, I think he's still present in the chat. He's doing a creative writing PhD, and the structure of the advice that he received from his supervisors, which is like, I get to work with these amazing scholars who are so talented, and I learn from them. But every other week we gather and we give him critique on his writing, which is both creative and academic, because he does both. So yeah, and he's really good in taking it all on board and then making it his own. But academia has a lot more opportunities for that. In creative writing, you need to look for this, I think.
Well, and something that I miss so much in creative writing is like conference presentations, where you get to like take your ideas that are in progress and talk with people about them and answer their questions, and sort of, I mean, it can be stressful, of course, but when it's in a friendly environment, to be able to think through things that you haven't published yet, you haven't finished yet, in a way that's like really, really productive, and that people want to contribute to what it is that you're thinking about and what you're doing. And that it's sort of like this expectation that it's a mutual and reciprocal experience, that you're going to contribute to their work, they're going to contribute to yours, and everybody comes out stronger in the end. There really isn't a lot of that in writing communities creatively, I think. And I think I really miss that when, you're working on an idea that you're not sure if it's quite there yet. You're not sure if you've like done everything that you could do. Sometimes having those conversations, I really miss being able to like sit around like a boardroom table and be like, okay, let's all talk about what it is we're working on and tell each other how we can make it better.
Yeah, that sounds great. I wish we had more opportunities for that.
Me too.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think the problem is academia, a lot of that is much stronger when you're a student. And so you do get the phenomenon of people write the first book from the dissertation and then really struggle to write a second, which is a very common career path. And I think it's not just to do with the fact you get too busy, but you just don't have that collaborative structure anymore. So I feel like maybe, older academics as well could learn from that. I wonder if there are other lessons you would take either way, right? You just brought up, Emmy, the idea, that I hadn't really thought of, that conferences allow for in the process, early feedback, and it would be nice to have something like that in creative writing. Are there other elements of academia that you would like to see work in creative writing, and vice versa, right? Are there parts of creative writing world that you would like to bring into academia more? And
I wish that mentorship in creative writing wasn't so expensive. That's something that I lament for my authors all the time, is that there is no, I mean, short of doing an MFA, which is its own kind of expensive, but I mean, especially once you're sort of in that career stage where you've published a book or two and you're expected to sort of be at this level where you're like producing more writing and where you're good at what you're doing. But if you want feedback on your early ideas, if you want people to sort of give you critique, the only paths that you have are either to go to totally unmoderated forums, which is not, I think, healthy for any author, honestly, or to pay sometimes like hundreds or thousands of dollars to take writing workshops or to attend conferences. And yeah, even in those spaces, it's not necessarily an atmosphere of trust. Often it's quite competitive. And often those spaces aren't open to people who have experience or who have kind of a pedigree or a reputation as an author already. And people, I can imagine, would be quite, like, it's quite a vulnerable position to put yourself in if you are in a position where you have a reputation to uphold, or just because it's very difficult to then come and say like, oh, I'm not sure about these ideas if you're holding on to like an award in the background, right? But yeah, I think like writing groups can be a great way to get around that, but not everybody has that social structure just built in automatically into their lives. And I feel like the mentorship structure that exists in academia, even at least for older academics, I realize that this isn't always like a healthy thing either, but the tenure process at least sort of has benchmarks for you to meet, and your department has some sort of responsibility to you to kind of help you along that path. There's at least motivation for them to do that. But yeah, none of that exists in creative writing. And I really wish that there were more opportunities for like bridging the skill levels between people who are brand new to the industry and people who have been around for a very long time and know their way. You know, it's like familiar water for them.
So do you think in the creative writing, I mean, I really don't know about this. Is there not an expectation of the responsibility to mentor? Or?
No, not really. I mean, short of having a job at a college or like a university where you're teaching writing, no, there's no expectation, I think, other than that you'll put out more books maybe.
I think sometimes, like in my position, I'm friends with a lot of writers who are aspiring writers, who are at different stages, who haven't been published yet. And even though I don't have unlimited time to give them, I try to do as much as I can by, being encouraging or sharing, truthful experience about based on my experience. And, occasionally I can help somebody by looking at their query material or submission material, but it's not something that I do. Some people charge a lot of money for that as a service. They're freelance editors who do that work for quite a lot of money. I think in terms of answering the question of what I would like to take from academia into creative writing, and I'll try to express my idea, but in terms of publishing in academia, even though it's no guarantee that you'll get an article published, there are so many opportunities for that to happen. There are so many different journals. You submit to one, it goes to peer review, you get some peer review back, editor makes a decision. It's more of a transparent process. You can see why the journal wouldn't publish the article, right? They say something, it's not a good fit because this reviewer has outlined a number of critiques, and you kind of look at them as like, yeah, I can see where it's coming from. I can see that this person is not malicious or whatever, that they just have their agenda in mind or their area in mind. And in academia, it's so transparent. You see what's happening most of the time. But in writing, and when you sell in the book, and Amy, you're more of an expert in this than I only know what my agent tells me, or that it's a mysterious process of decisions being made about based on feeling, on thinking, or what will do well, what is going to hit big or not a breakout. Is it going to break out be your breakout book or not? And that's like, how is it some kind of crystal gazing? What is going on there? Is this what are they trying to look into the future somehow and have some supernatural abilities to do so? And and the book goes to acquisitions, and even if your editor loved the book, sales and marketing people may not like your book, and they might say, nah, we don't think it's going to do well. We don't have a good feeling about it.
I was having this conversation with an editor friend literally today, because if the author does their job perfectly and writes a gem of a book, if I do my job perfectly and send it to, like a phenomenal, perfect fit editor, there still might just be somebody at the table who's like having a bad day from publicity or marketing, who might just be like, nope, like, I don't know how to sell this. And that's like, then the book is done. Like, that's the end of that process. You never get to know why or who they are or what you know, what the issue is, it's very tricky.
Yeah, and you know, even when sometimes you get back some kind of two sentences of why, the reason, sometimes you get from an agent, you know, a lot of agents try, I think they try as much, everybody doesn't have a lot of free time, right? So, but sometimes they try to tell you that did work for me, or I have another book that's similar on my list, you know, that's fair enough, fair enough. But sometimes when you get that reason for why they rejected it, it just doesn't feel like, you know, this is something that I can fix. I can come in and fix that plot something, or beef up the characterization, or these are things that can be fixed. So clearly they're just giving you a reason that maybe is just the tip of the iceberg of what actually went behind the curtain, behind the stage, which, you know, I don't know what's going on there. So I wish there was more, at least transparency, to understand why you're not it's not happening for you, for your book.
And more accountability as well, because a lot of these people who, once you're at the publisher stage, a lot of the people making the decision, they're not forward facing, right? They don't interact with the public at all. And so like even your agent may never know why, you know, an editor can write back to me and say like, nope, it just wasn't the right book. And like that can be their whole explanation 6 months after I've sent them a manuscript that, you know, we've been talking about for the better part of, you know, like half a year. And there's no mechanism for the author, the agent, anybody to have any insight into why. There's no expectation of feedback. There's no expectation of accountability. It's really, really hard.
There's a lot of reference to romance and love, in the sense, I didn't love this. I liked it, but I didn't love this. I wasn't in love with this book.
I didn't connect with the voice.
Yeah, I did connect with the voice. Or when you hear all these things for what they would skip, like the voice is too pop, the voice is too creepy, the voice is too fast, the pace is too fast, the pace is too slow. Like it's subjective, right? But
lazy.
Yeah,
I just didn't fall in love. That's my least favorite.
I write way too many reviews and refereeing, and I would love to be able to just write back and say, hey, I didn't love this.
Somehow I wasn't in love with your theorizing.
Why the feeling of love did not arise in reading them.
So, I mean,
you don't want to marry it.
That was the thing that for me, like if there's one thing that I want to bring from academia into publishing, it's nuance. Because I think that there's a lot of that missing in publishing on all levels, and I mean that will feed into accountability as well. And I know that part of the problem is that you're dealing with vastly different numbers in publishing than you are in academia. I mean, there are so many people who want to get a book published. So many people. I think there's far fewer people looking to get a PhD, and then even fewer people on the academic job market, which is still extremely competitive. You know, it's scary how competitive it is, but just the way that publishing is so commercial kind of just obliterates nuance, I think, in a lot of conversations in multiple areas. So for me, I want more nuance in publishing.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have two questions actually that take us a slightly different direction, but I'd like to get to them. That are thinking about kind of the different nature of not so much in terms of practices, but in terms of what creative writing and scholarship produce. So one from Alice here is asking whether the driving impetus might be different, that academic writing comes from some point of critique, whereas the initial act of creative writing is maybe a kind of release, with the critique coming later. So this is one way, I guess. Do you think of that as one way of distinguishing the two practices of academic writing and creative writing?
So something that actually sticks out to me, my hands in the webcam, sorry. Something that sticks out to me in that question is this idea of the sort of creative release of writing. And I know we were talking a lot about catharsis earlier, and assisting with mental health and everything. But I do think that there is no ubiquitous creative release when you write fiction. There's immense moments of frustration and banging your head on the wall, especially when you are a little bit more experienced as a writer. you stop approaching your fiction as just like me writing for me. You're a lot more careful because you understand the barriers that will face you once you get into the industry or the commercialization of your work. And so when I wrote the very first draft of my very first manuscript, it was, absolutely creative release because I was just, stream of consciousness, vomiting words on the page. But, when I wrote, after editing it for 8 years and finally getting it published, my second book, I had a very different mentality. And so I actually didn't experience that same creative release. I was much more methodical. But as a result, I actually had a much better first draft of a book. So I do think that there's an argument to be made about, academic writing originating from a point of critique. I'm just rereading the question here to serve a purpose. But I do think that there are aspects of that in creative writing as well once you are in the industry.
Also, like, this is just a very brief answer, but I think that if you're writing a novel and you don't have an underlying purpose for writing it, that will come across to your reader pretty clearly, at least in my impression. Like, a lot of readers will come out of a book and be like, yeah, I liked that, but like, what was the point? And like, there's definitely space for books like that, and not every reader is going to see the point of every book. Like, there's a lot of gray in that statement, but I think that overall, if you're writing a book and you don't have kind of a goal in mind, even if it's just a personal goal, like, people will miss that core, of kind of what you're trying to say or process or feel with the work that you're producing. So I think they're more tightly related than maybe people realize.
I think that's a really good point, because what you just said, Amy, just has changed my mind over the course of the last minute as I was thinking about my own answer. Because I was going to say, going back to the beginning, how every time I start a new article, I would start with, what will be the contribution to knowledge? What do I want this article to say? Why does it need to exist? Why I will spend all this time and with your reviewers' time. So, and how will this article fit into my overall body of academic knowledge? How will it advance maybe some knowledge that I'm part of? Anyway, but at the same time, you're right. I think that is, in a way, also part of how we make decisions about creative projects too. What do I want it to say? What, in the end, what is the story? Why does the story need to exist? Because if it's not personal to me, to the author in some way, then what's the point of writing it? I mean, maybe it's just my thinking, but everything I write is very, very personal to me in some way. So, I give part of myself to each of the characters that I create, kind of, and explore parts of myself. So I think it's, same question, but asked from different angles, maybe.
We also had a question that was submitted before our discussion, but I think it's a fascinating one from Mary from York University, who asks, what do you believe might move scholarship beyond privileging factual truth over the verisimilitude represented in literature?
Can I take this one?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, just because I actually, this is sort of one of the things that fascinates me, and this is part of my scholarly research, is how representation in literature actually speaks about, this is a contentious word in scholarship, but reality. So
you have to say plural, realities.
Realities, yes. So, I mean, as I kind of said at the very beginning of this panel, I study the supernatural in literature and its relationship to violence outside of fiction. And I've always kind of approached my creative writing as an extension of my scholarly work. And so, as I was saying earlier, like, one can't really exist without the other for me. So there's actually a line in my book, The Hollow Gods, and it goes, stories aren't told to convey the facts, they're told to convey the truth. And so for me, actually this distinction between fact and truth has always been really important, because I think when they're conflated, we tend to treat the non-factual at worst as kind of just not being important, or at best as a metaphor for something that's important. So it's kind of removed from importance, I guess. And so I think that that's just a disservice to treat verisimilitude, if you will. I had to practice saying that word because it's a word I always read but never say. You know, it's a disservice to kind of treat it as purely metaphorical. And what made me really appreciate this was actually that, you know, when I was writing, you know, supernatural horror or cosmic horror or using folklore to explore real world issues in my fiction, it was a very visceral experience for me as a writer. And so to render all of that kind of simply as metaphor is somehow alienating, I guess, and a little bit reductive for me. And so ultimately relegating these things to just metaphor, I realized kind of create this hierarchy of knowledge production implicitly anyway. So actually to get back to your question of what can we do about this, like how do we rethink this or challenge it? I think we need to stop treating literary texts as just objects of study that give us metaphors for the real world, and instead to kind of treat them more as something that is experienced. Someone experienced this on a visceral level when they were creating it, and it's truthful, even if it isn't factual. And so, you know, and actually the way that histories were written, I mean, the whole historiography as a discipline is a very like modern thing, but the way that people have written history in different cultures or at different times wasn't always entirely quote unquote factual. And so we do have a precedent for this. But yeah, I think just understanding that, you know, for example, fact and you know, narratives that are not factual, those things aren't necessarily oppositional.
I think I cringe every time you say the word truth because I can't decide if you're saying it with a capital T or a lowercase t inside of my brain. I was just going to say, I feel like one of the things I've been really grateful for in terms of like, this time I actually have a practical answer, so I have to jump in and give it in my own scholarship, is that my supervisor at McMaster is an Anishinaabe scholar, and I've been really, really lucky to be able to work with Indigenous knowledges and theories in my own work, like to the extent that I'm able to and should as a white scholar. But I will say that decolonial methods are, scholars who are working in that area are doing incredible things in terms of integrating like sources of quote unquote knowledge that are non-traditional. So when you're talking about fact, I think this is what I'm trying to get at, Alex, is that like, you know, a lot of cultures, the idea of like recording fact the way that we do in Western academic culture is like a very new thing to do. And there are lots of records of Indigenous knowledges that have nothing to do with scholarship, but that are still accessible to lots of people, and that, you know, Indigenous scholars and activists have asked people to engage with in like in productive ways. And so I did a lot of reading of Indigenous poetry, Indigenous philosophy, like Indigenous memoir as sources of knowledge for my dissertation. And that was probably one of the most interesting, and like it was a very humbling experience to be able to read all these different sources and to have different ways of knowing influence the way that I was doing my work was honestly just a lot more fun and a lot more enriching than just sitting with sort of academic texts all the time. You know, in social work, we read a lot of like psychology and a lot of public health, and it's a lot of statistics. Some of it is very dry. And so like having that balance was so important and so interesting for my academic work that I think that if sort of deconstructing that binary between the academic and the creative is something that people are interested in, looking at what decolonial scholars are doing is a really good first step along that path, I guess.
Such a good advice, because you're so right. Bringing those methodologies as well, like Indigenous ways of approaching the construction of knowledge into Western academia, that is so like can produce such amazing results. Like for example, a lot of methods in Western knowledge have to do with, you know, I am the person who gathers this knowledge from you. I am the moderator. I'm the you know, I am the one will ask you questions and you will sit there and answer my questions. But here, you know, in Australia, we have this, you know, Indigenous yarning circles where people just sit in a circle and everybody's equal. There is no hierarchy here. and they all share something, and it's almost like a focus group, but it's really the power of it has been redistributed. So there is, nobody really is in charge, but everybody is in charge. And the knowledge that it can produce can really transcend some of the limitations that we would face otherwise if we didn't go this way, if we try to interview people rigidly or something. And just not to take up too much time, but you everything you've said is great, and Alex, I agree with. I think just what we can do is bring in these methodologies into the Western canon of how knowledge is produced and created, and also interdisciplinarity. I think working across disciplines, because coming from anthropology, the first thing I learned is anthropology is not sociology. You must be very, very clear in that. It's a very different discipline, very different methods, very, and all these disciplines are like silos. They could be very isolated, and working across disciplines can just bring some amazing results. And I think we need more of that interdisciplinarity and more diversity in our methods and methodological frameworks that we work with. That's it for me.
Great.
No, I agree. And I think that working with community as well, and sort of working, even just breaking down these boundaries of what we consider to be like legitimate in academia. And yeah, I feel like I have to stick that in, because of course, like appropriating Indigenous work or work from other cultures straight into academia doesn't work either. But those collaborative approaches where we can work with communities and with sort of knowledge producers who are in different fields can be so much more fun and so much more interesting and fruitful, I think, in the long term.
Yeah.
Great.
I can see that there's a message about 5.
Yeah, we're pretty much at time. So maybe just to finish up, it's been really great conversation, but I'd like to ask each of you very briefly in our final minute, if you had to give advice, or if there's one thing you wanted to share from your experience in being in these different worlds, what would it be that you most want to share?
Kind to yourself.
Sorry?
Be kind to yourself. I mean, truly. But, yeah.
I'm going to steal my final message, if that's okay. I went to a panel that Nnedi Okorafor gave in Denver a couple of years ago, and I remember someone asking her what advice she would give to up-and-coming authors, and she said to the audience that the biggest thing that stands in the way of more diverse voices and more nuanced stories being told is that people don't get the chance to. So don't ever give up on the stories that you have to tell, and also don't take for granted your ability to be able to tell them. We might not always have the freedom to be able to tell stories the way that we do now, and to do the research that we have the access to be able to do now. And I think that especially in the political moment that we're all in, that's a really important message. So that would be what I would tell people.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, just don't limit yourself. You can do everything. You can write a book and be in academia and be a scholar and be a writer. It's tricky, but it's possible. Look at how many people are doing it. People with full-time jobs write books. People in academia can do that as well. So and yeah, my advice is don't give up on yourself, on your ideas, and surround yourself with people who will support you and encourage you, and provide you with valuable feedback that you can use to improve yourself, your craft, your writing. Yeah. And feel free to reach out after this event if you have any questions or just to share ideas. I'm on all social media or whatever, so just please feel free to keep in touch.
I think we're all on social media. So.
Yeah.
If you dig hard enough, you'll find us.
We're there. We're everywhere.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that great advice at the end and for a great discussion. I see that you put your contact info in the chat, so if anyone wants to contact you, I think this is an ongoing conversation, right, that doesn't end. But maybe for now we'll bring this evening to an end, but hope to meet again and read your books and read many more books to come in the future, and continue the conversation.